women especially get stuck with this overwhelming need for safety and security, and it keeps us from investing our money in order to grow what we need for our future.
What I think is important to understand with that is that the security we feel when we're holding on to cash is false security. If holding on to cash today and keeping it in low interest bearing accounts is meaning that your wealth is not growing at a rate to support your needs in the future, then you are robbing yourself. And so the safety that you feel in the moment isn't true safety.
Hey everyone, I'm Jean Chatzky. Thanks so much for joining me today on HerMoney. So if you're a regular listener, you know that every week on this show, every episode on this show, we spend some time talking about how to get control of your money. And in many cases, that means getting control of your spending and knowing, if not exactly, then certainly a little bit more than today, where your money is going. Having this knowledge sounds basic, but it's actually really important. Without knowing what you're doing, many of us just go through life spending, tapping, clicking, dipping, using our money unconsciously and sabotaging ourselves without ever realizing it. When you think of financial self-sabotage, your mind may go to impulse spending on clothes or whatever it is that you like to buy online, taking on too much credit card debt, keeping too much money in cash because it feels quote unquote safe. The truth is there are so many ways that we can torpedo our financial efforts without realizing it. But anytime we take an action that prevents us from reaching our financial goals, it is technically a form of self-sabotage. And one of those actions could be inaction. My guest today, Sarah Newcomb, takes it one step further. She says that even when we do something innocuous, like prioritizing saving for a child's college education over our own retirement, that's a form of sabotage. She's going to dive in with me on this topic today. Sarah is an applied behavioral scientist at Edward Jones. She is the author of the book Loaded: Money, Psychology, and How to Get Ahead Without Leaving Your Values Behind. If you're an OG HerMoney listener, you'll remember we had Sarah back on years ago to talk about the difference between wants and needs, which is still one of my favorite episodes of all time. Sarah, welcome back to the show.
Jean, it's so great to be here. Thank you so much.
It is great to have you here. So since we last talked, you have a new job. Tell us about what you're doing today.
Yeah, I've been up to so much in the meantime. I've continued my research into mindset and financial behavior and how both of those things connect to well-being. I've also been doing a lot of work in financial education. I'm really passionate about helping the next generation to develop healthy financial mindsets from the outset. And so I've done a lot of work with Jumpstart, the National Coalition for Financial Education. They're a great group. It's mostly teachers, volunteers, and they're working really hard to advocate for and spread financial education for our kids. So I've done a lot of work with them, and it was really the biggest honor of my career to win their Visionary Leadership Award this last April. And that was for my work in helping financial educators understand the connection between mental health and financial health. Such an important connection. And then most recently, I've joined up with Edward Jones, where I am working to help their 19,000 advisors across the country to be better coaches and guides by understanding some basic psychology of finance and understanding that connection between mindset, financial behavior, and overall life satisfaction and well-being.
is so interesting and so incredibly needed. I want to hear more about that connection between financial health and mental health. But before we get there, I'm wondering how we've changed since the pandemic. As you look at the way that humans are behaving with our money, is there anything new that you've noted in this post-COVID world?
Well, I'll tell you, when COVID first hit, there was a really positive reaction financially. Americans started saving and paying off their credit cards and paying down debt. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful to see. And then it stopped. And we're back to credit card balances being almost a trillion or more. If you look at the credit card balances of America's over time, they're higher than ever. And so I think for a moment, we got scared. We got responsible.
We got stimulus checks.
Yep. And a lot of people put it toward paying down their debt. And because when uncertainty increased, the having debt felt more uncomfortable. Once life got back to a little bit more of a normal rhythm, or let's just say we developed a new normal, now people have become comfortable again. And borrowing is a pastime, it seems.
Yeah, it definitely does. That debt number is way over $1 trillion at this point, and the numbers on consumer saving, the national savings rate has continued to trend down. The Federal Reserve in St. Louis tracks that. I'm curious, we talked about financial self-sabotage and what it is in a variety of ways at the top of the show. What's your definition?
I love this question because we get to dive right into psychology. So I'm sure that everyone is at least a little bit familiar with the framework Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but just a quick primer on it. It just basically says that there are 5 types of needs that humans have. They start with survival, food, shelter, transportation, security, knowing that we'll be okay in the long term, connection, human connection, love, esteem, both from ourselves and others, and self-actualization, meaning, purpose. And what's really important to understand about this framework is that these needs are first universal. We all have them. We have them in common. And they're all needs. It's not Maslow's hierarchy of wants. So it's not as if self-actualization is this nice to have thing that some people will achieve if they climb up the pyramid or some lifetime goal. Self-actualization, purpose, and meaning are just as important day to day in order to feel satisfied and content as a human being. And so it's not a hierarchy and that the things at the top aren't needs and the things at the bottom are. It doesn't work like that. So once you understand that, just understanding that we have these 5 categories of needs, the reason that's important to understand when it comes to self-sabotage is that anytime there is self-sabotage, you can be sure that there are at least 2 needs in play, and that your strategy for meeting one of them is sabotaging your ability to meet the other one. So your need for maybe adventure in the moment or connection, traveling with friends, for example, if your strategy for meeting that need means that you can't hit your savings goals, you're missing your savings contribution that month, now you're sabotaging your long-term goals, which maybe weren't as top of mind. And you do that 2, 3 times a year and you have some long-term problems.
I have even noticed and wrote a little bit in Women with Money about the fact that people get stuck at that second tier. Women especially get stuck at that second tier with this overwhelming need for safety and security, and it keeps us from investing our money in order to grow what we need for our future.
Yes, it's definitely an issue. And what I think is important to understand with that is that the security we feel when we're holding on to cash is false security. Because if holding on to cash today and keeping it in low interest bearing accounts is meaning that your wealth is not growing at a rate to support your needs in the future, then you are robbing yourself. You are robbing future self of resources. And so the safety that you feel in the moment isn't true safety.
When we talk about the things that we should be doing with our money: saving, investing, protecting, earning. I think at this point, many people know what those things are. And yet, we continue to make stupid decisions. We continue to allow these underlying emotions to get the better of us. Why, even when we know the right thing to do we do the wrong thing?
Well, a lot of it is that we have developed known strategies for getting our needs met. And so in the moment is a terrible time to come up with a new strategy. If we're not mindful and thinking ahead of time, how else might I get my need for connection, adventure, confidence, whatever it may be? It falls into those somewhere in those 5 categories. How else might I meet that need without sabotaging another? If we're not doing that in a moment when we're calm, cool, and collected, we're not prepared for the moment when we're emotionally charged. And so we have to come up with alternate strategies for ourselves ahead of time so that they're top of mind for an alternate behavior in the heat of the moment.
That heat of the moment is really difficult when life gets in the way. You did some research at Edward Jones that looked at women as caregivers and reported that nearly 2/3 of women in the sandwich generation say their caregiving responsibilities have impacted their ability to save for their own financial goals. Is that a form of self-sabotage, or is that just life? Because I've had older parents, I've seen many caregivers. I don't know how you say no to that in the moment when you've got additional years that you could perhaps work on the back end.
Right. And this one is really tough to tackle because caregiving is such an emotionally and morally loaded undertaking. And it's really easy to justify putting our own needs on hold. We just think we're just putting them on hold. Like you said, I've got more years, I'm young, I'm still well, right? So we think we're putting it on hold to care for our children or our parents' needs. But what happens is that women often sabotage their retirement by giving too much away during their peak earning years. And so that can be both time and money. And I want to just clarify, this is research that Edward Jones did this year with an external partner. There's a report that I think is really interesting. I didn't do this research. I've read this research, but it's really fascinating because they looked at women and found that they really felt like, first of all, the CFO of their whole life and of their household. And women are very much in charge of the day-to-day finances, and very much the caregiving responsibilities for both the younger generation and the older generation are falling on women. No surprise to anyone, I'm sure. But if we're giving away time and money during our peak earning years, even if it's things like paying for college so that kids won't be burdened by debt, or reducing your paid labor hours so that you can engage in unpaid labor. That's another way. These things, they're not innately wrong, but if you do them at the expense of your own security, then you are setting yourself up for hardship. You're setting yourself up to need caregiving in the future. And that will affect your loved ones too. So I think what we need to learn, and where this does tie back to my research on mindset, is that we really need to learn how to hold on to a long-term view when we're weighing our short-term decisions. So if we're clear-eyed about what it will take to care for ourselves in retirement, that will help us better weigh what we actually have to offer responsibly today. And it may be that by balancing this view of long and short term, we end up working a little harder in the short term to devise strategies where we're able to get the needs met in the moment without sabotaging our long-term needs.
So you know me well enough that you know I'm going to ask you to get tactical about
Yeah.
this and tell us how to do that. But before you do, just to throw a little water on this, I mean, your research also showed that while in general women are better at thinking long term with their money than men are, there are some periods in our lives where the opposite is true. So, what's going on there?
Yeah, well, so this was really interesting, and I do want to get back to the tactical, but this was really fascinating to me. So I recently did some research with Jones, and we looked at people's what I call your mental time horizon. So this is how far, when you're thinking about your money, how far are you tending to think into the future? You know, is it to your next paycheck? Is it to your next big purchase? Is it to your next big life event? Is it till the kids are in school? Or is it to retirement? Is it to the end of my life? Is it to future generations? And what was interesting, I had hypothesized that because we know that women are better long term investors on the whole, I had thought that would be because we are thinking intergenerationally more often as caregivers. That's what I thought I would see. But what I actually saw was that women tend to be shorter term thinkers than men. And while both men and women, as we get older, we become longer term thinkers, somewhere around midlife, around somewhere in that 35 to 55 window, men keep on elongating their mental time horizon and women sort of flatten out.
Mm.
And it makes sense. I don't have enough data to say this is because of caregiving, but it makes a lot of sense that this also coincides with the time in our lives when we tend to get sandwiched and when the needs of the people that we love crowd out our ability to think about our own life 20 years from now.
Yeah, it's truly fascinating. And you're right. It's people in that 35 to 55 window. It's just hitting the millennials, as a number of publications have really been pointing out lately. The big story in the Wall Street Journal today, just about that generation. We are going to get tactical about what to do about this problem, how to get ourselves to think long term if that's what it's going to take in order to stop self-sabotaging, and whether or not we can employ technology to help us along the way. We are back. We're talking with Sarah Newcomb, behavioral scientist at Edward Jones. So when you think about how to get yourself to do this right, how to hack yourself to a solution, how to fool yourself into not making these mistakes, however you want to put it, what are your best tips for keeping that long term in mind, making the right day to day decisions? It's this long term, short term dance that's very difficult.
Yeah, it's this balance. There's that concept of a wise mind that sort of blends the emotional with the logical. I think of this as like we need to find our financial wise mind that blends the long term with the short term. If you're on either extreme, you're probably unhealthy financially. Even people who think long term all the time, they have trouble enjoying the moment. But if you're thinking short term all the time, you're sabotaging the long term. So we need to find that financial wise mind. And I think that one of the things that we need to get better at in general, and a financial advisor can really help with this because it does involve some complicated numbers. The thing that most of us don't do enough of early on is really getting clear about the lifestyle that we want to have later in life, really making some decisions about that. And once that's clear, then what you can do is figure out about how much that lifestyle will cost you. And without that estimation, when do you think you'll be living this lifestyle? For how long? And how much is it going to cost? Without that, any of your savings and investment numbers, they're arbitrary. They don't make sense. If you don't have a North Star goal, you don't know what growth rate you need in order to achieve it, what savings rate you need. And so while I love rules of thumb because they're easy to remember, they're easy to apply, this is one case where a rule of thumb is not going to work. We really have to take the time to think about the long term in detail. But the good news is that we don't have to do this all the time. If you do this early enough to get your estimate for your lifestyle, how much it will cost, then you can make the plan for how to get there. And once you set those mechanisms in motion, again, working with an advisor so they can run the numbers so that you know that your estimations are both realistic and accurate,
Mm-hmm.
taking inflation into account, taking different things into account. Once you've got that, then you can set some of these things on autopilot, freeing yourself up to pay attention to the needs of the moment, knowing that you have taken care of the long term. It's taking care of itself.
So, a couple of follow ups there. And by the way, I think you're totally right. I just moderated a panel in DC a couple of weeks ago. There was a woman on my panel who had run the numbers and basically said, I'm not changing my lifestyle. Like when I retire, I don't want to have to cut back. This is why I've been working so hard. And I thought, good for you. Because I think a lot of people really feel that way, and we tell ourselves that we'll spend less, and then we get into trouble because we just weren't honest with ourselves. So, when should you run this calculation?
Ideally, as soon as possible, right? The best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time is today. It's the same principle here. If you haven't done this, do this. And if you're afraid to do it because you're afraid you won't like what you'll see, all I can say is it will only get worse every day that you wait. And I can't express the peace of mind that you can accomplish once you know that your savings and your investments are on track. Because you know what it does? It makes every single day-to-day financial decision easier because it's picking numbers out of the sky. Let's just say you've decided, I want to save 20% and I'm investing that in a certain way. Now, you don't need to itemize your budget at this point. As long as your debt is not overwhelming you and you're hitting that savings and investment goal, it doesn't matter whether you spent the rest at Target or on taxis or whatever. Enjoy it. As long as you have met those long-term responsibilities, the moment is yours. The rest you can spend without needing to itemize and agonize over everything. So when you know that that number works for you, then you have peace of mind.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's how I budget day to day. I hit my savings goals, and the rest basically takes care of itself. The other big factor in the mix, and other big factor in the mix, is that investing style that we talked about, and a lot of recommendations tell us to get more conservative about our investments as we age. If you look at the glide path of a target date fund, it's taking less and less risk as we age. You push back on this. How do you think we should be investing?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't think we talk about inflation in retirement enough. The reality is that here's another rule of thumb that at a 3% inflation rate, prices double every 24 years. So if you retire at 65 and let's say your lifestyle costs you $100,000, then when you're 89, it will take $200,000 to live that same lifestyle. Now, at 89, you'll be living a different lifestyle than you were at 65. It may be a little less in terms of travel, but it may be more in terms of healthcare.
Yeah.
And so again, this is where working with someone who has some good numbers on this can be very helpful if you feel overwhelmed. But knowing that you need your money to last a period of time where prices will continue to increase, that's just how our money system works. And so you can't plan for your income on day one to be sufficient in year 20. So we need to make sure that what we're taking from our assets, that we're not taking so much that it isn't continuing to grow to be able to care for our needs long term. It has to continue to grow to at least beat inflation. So you don't necessarily need to be invested aggressively, but you do need to be invested to the point where you know your assets are likely you won't outlive them. This is where the numbers do get complicated, and it's
Yeah.
really helpful to have some professional opinion involved. But again, once you know that number, there's so much less uncertainty and background fear in the back of your mind that can be resolved, because if you know that you've also factored inflation into your plans, then again, you can rest easy.
We talked a little bit about caregiving and how difficult it is not to help when that's the call that you're hearing. Kids are another part of the story. College costs are out of control. There's no other real way to put that. How do you decide where to draw the line between trying to help your kids minimize the debt that they're going to carry and trying to save for yourself?
Yeah. Financial enablement is a big, juicy topic. And I'm not immune. I have an adult child now. It's hard to let your kids struggle when you could spare them from it. But I think it's really important as parents, we need to understand that healthy growth and development actually requires a balance between support and challenge. And if we don't let our kids face tough challenges, they won't develop in a healthy way. They won't become the mature adults that they can be. So I think the best thing for us as parents is to understand the difference between support and enablement. And there's a very simple question that I think any parent of an adult child should ask themselves, which is, am I working harder for their financial security than they are?
Mm.
And if the answer is yes, then you may be at risk of actually standing in the way of them being able to reach the development milestones that they need to become the self-actualized adults that they want to be. So enablement is the line we don't want to cross.
If you suspect, based on the answer to that question, that you're guilty of this, how do you pull back?
There is a great parenting concept called scaffolding, where you develop supports. You put some supports up around them, but not so much that it's control, right? So there are ways that you can work with your kids to help them grow more independent in steps. So, for example, rather than gifting your child a car, you could say, look, I'm going to give you a budget to work within and some conditions, right? So it needs to be in New England. It's got to be all-wheel drive. It needs to get decent gas mileage and whatever your conditions are. And here's the budget that I'm willing to contribute. Now, you go out and you find yourself a car. And if it's more than this amount that I'm willing to contribute, then you're going to need to find a way to make up the difference. That's what I mean when I say it, doing a little work ahead of time to come up with a different strategy where you're getting creative and you're able to help them stretch their skills, gain some independence, but you're not just saying, look, it's all on you.
Right, right. Sometimes the battle is not with wanting to help somebody else. It's just a battle we're fighting with ourselves and our impulses. I'm guilty of a little too much online shopping. I know a lot of our listeners feel that they are as well. What do you suggest if it's just the random shopping from time to time that's getting in your way?
Yeah. And this is where I think it can be an opportunity, if you are willing, for personal growth. That can be really gratifying. But this is where, going back to what we talked about several years ago, knowing the difference between needs and strategies for meeting needs and why it's so important to understand the deep underlying needs that you're meeting. Because when you're shopping, there are needs that you're meeting. It might be that you're not feeling very confident. That's the big one for me when shiny objects are so alluring to me when I'm not feeling so shiny. And it's so easy to go and buy the thing that's going to say, well, the person who wears those boots is definitely cool, calm, and confident all the time. So you can buy yourself this little boost. But again, this goes back to strategies that we know they work, at least temporarily, but not in the long run. And so if you find yourself, if your self-sabotage is overspending, then first of all, you are not alone. I am right there with you. But it is absolutely possible to get to a point where you can meet those needs in really satisfying ways without spending as much money. So for me, for example, I learned that when I'm feeling like shopping, I first need to ask myself, am I lonely, bored, insecure, or sad? Are those things happening? Because if those things are happening, shopping won't fix them, really won't. But taking a bubble bath might, or curling up with a book or calling a friend. And so coming up with another strategy other than shopping.
Lonely, bored, insecure, or sad. For me, it's often just I'm bored.
Yep. And shopping can be so fun, but sometimes it's just a time filler. And I think we can be better at being less boring in how we fill our time and coming up with new things to do that light us up in different ways.
Sarah Newcomb, always such a pleasure to talk to you. Anything that you want to point us to that you have published lately, or a place that you'd like us to go?
I want to harken back to this research on women and investing, and especially the caregiving point, because I think it's really important for us to understand. And I did I read a bunch of papers recently following up on it around women and caregiving. And I just want to leave people with a little bit of knowledge that they might not have, which is that what researchers have found in studying women who do leave work to fill a caregiving role is that rather than their life satisfaction increasing in retirement, it decreases. I think that it would be wise of us to start to consider staying in the workforce longer to pay professional caregivers so that we can meet the needs of our loved ones without setting ourselves up for discontent and possibly resentment and very strained relationships down the line. So I would point to any research on caregiving and mental health as a cautionary tale that it may be worth your while to think of other ways to meet the need.
Well, and with mental health in that sentence, you reminded me that I wanted to ask you about the work that you did with Jumpstart.
Yeah.
What is that important link between financial health and mental health, and where do we go off the rails?
Well, specifically with financial education, the point that I was trying to make to financial educators is that we have a generation of kids that are so stressed about money that if you ask them about their financial future, they would say, I don't have one. They're angry, they're overwhelmed, they're scared, and many of them have experienced generations of financial trauma. And you can't go into a classroom with someone who has been shut down by generations of trauma and say, here, I'm going to teach you some about how to invest. When you have $100,000, do this with it. Because you know what they're going to say? They're going to say, don't teach me the rules of a game that I can't win. I know I can't get in that game. That's not for me. And you've shut them down before you've ever even taught them anything. And so my point about mental health and financial education is that we need to understand that a lot of people are coming to the table with emotional baggage that has told them that they will not be able to get ahead. And so we don't need to start with, here's what to do when you have money. I think we need to start with, here's how you figure out how you are going to go out there and make something wonderful by taking your skills, your special sauce, your interests, your time, your energy, your intelligence. And yes, it might be harder for you than someone else because of the way you look or your name or your history. But that's why you'll be so much prouder of yourself when you actually do it. But starting with, how do you create value and go out there into the world and get people past wage slavery, help them to make that first investment in themselves and believe that there is a possibility that they can do it. If we don't do that first, the rest is just a math class that they're going to ignore.
Oh, so smart. Sarah, thank you so much for this and all the other conversations that came before. I always learn something when I talk to you.
Thank you so much, Jean. It's wonderful.